What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Absolute Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Hunt, and we are back with the second episode of the Championship Bodybuilding book review, the new series I am doing on the podcast. If you didn't listen to the last episode, part 1 on training, you don't need to. I mean, I'll explain a little bit of what I'm doing if you missed that episode, but really in the first half of the book, we talked mostly about training, and like I hinted at the end of that episode, the nutrition side is better. I mean, I actually like the nutrition section of the book better. I think it was more interesting, more information, which makes sense. I mean, Chris Aceto is known as a nutrition guy. One thing I will say is I kind of started the book with, I started the podcast explaining how I knew Chris Aceto or how I knew who he was, and it was when I first got into the bodybuilding magazines. He was known as Jay Cutler's nutrition coach, contest prep coach, and I was like, I think he's still in the game, but I'm not sure. And then somebody made me aware, and I didn't check this, so I don't know if it's true or not, but a couple people said this, so I'm assuming it is, that Chris Aceto actually was the contest prep coach of Sean Roden, who won the Mr. Olympia last year, which I think he's still in the game, maybe. Turns out, yeah, he's still in the game and worked with the Mr. Olympia last year. So, again, I didn't check that out, but 2 or 3 people messaged me and told me that, so I'm just going to take their word for it. But anyway, so what we're doing here, and I got a lot of great feedback on the first episode, so thank you to everyone who reached out and said that they're excited about this new series. I'm excited for it. Last episode I told you I had a list of like 20 books. Well, I probably added about 10, so I'm at about, 28, 30 books that I have on my list right now that I want to go over on the podcast, really covering a wide range of stuff, which I'm excited about too. I mean, there's going to be a wide range of content here, and then, of course, I'm still going to do some Q&A episodes, still going to do some interviews, so this is an addition, not necessarily a subtraction, but definitely a cut down in interviews. If you missed the last episode, I basically explained, like, hey, this podcast was kind of built on the interview model. I got a chance to talk to a lot of great people, a lot of interesting people in the fitness industry and outside of the fitness industry. But now I'm at the point where, man, if I do an interview, I want it to be special. I want to really have a cool conversation. There's too many cookie cutter podcasts. So it's like, hey, if you guys want to listen to cookie cutter answers from your favorite fitness influencer on Instagram, shit, you'll have plenty of options. Just go search on Apple Podcast and I'm sure there's plenty. So we want something different here. We want a little bit different quality of content. So, I'm just going to keep pushing. And really, at the end of the day, it's for me. I'm being selfish because I want to be interested in this. I love podcasting. So I could feel it. Like, I could feel myself becoming a little less excited to jump on the mic and do these podcasts when I was just doing too many interviews. Quite frankly, I just think that's what happened. I just started doing too many interviews with people I wasn't super fired up to talk about. No disrespect to anybody I've had on the show. I've pretty much, if you've been on the show, I wanted to talk to you, but maybe not a 10 out of 10. Maybe it was like a 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10. Now it's a 10 out of 10. Like, if you come on the podcast, I'm super excited about it. So at the end of the day, hopefully that brings better and more valuable content. But really, like I said, I'm being selfish. I want to do this podcast the way I want to do it. And I just imagine that over time that'll be better content and people listening will enjoy it. And at the end of the day, that's one cool thing about podcasting right now. It's a very unique medium in that we have, there's so many options now. There's so many quality podcasts. I think this is even more so than YouTube. YouTube kind of, back in the day, even currently, there's a lot of YouTube channels that put out content regularly, and you can kind of pick and choose what you want and what you're interested in. But I think with podcasting it's just a little bit different. I just think the content is a little bit different. You're able to do it while you're driving right now, or walking on a treadmill, or walking the dog, or sitting at your desk pretending to work. Whatever it is you're doing right now, you're listening to this podcast. You don't need to be 100% focused and dialed in like you do for a video. You can be multitasking right now. And that's what's cool about podcasts. That's why I like them. That's why I listen to podcasts. I listen to podcasts while I go for my morning walk, while I'm driving to the gym, while I'm doing my warm-up at the gym, while I take the garbage out, while I'm doing pretty much anything that doesn't need my full attention. I'm like, shit, I'll just, listen to a podcast. And it feels, the one thing about podcasting that's great is while you're doing something that's usually considered, not productive, I guess you could say. I mean, it could be different levels of production, I guess, but something that maybe is not moving you forward, not moving the needle. I guess that's probably how I would look at it. Driving to the gym or doing dishes or mowing the lawn or something. That's not moving me forward. But if you can do that, something that needs to be done, and listen to a podcast and get some information from it, hey, it almost makes that time more productive, I guess. But anyway, so today we're going to talk about nutrition, cardio, supplementation. I like this. I like the second half of this book. I think you're going to enjoy it. Before we get to the content, as always, this podcast is sponsored by PR Breaker. PR Breaker Materia is the pre-workout I use and recommend, the best formula on the market, 3 great flavors. Can't talk about it enough. Use discount code HUNT10 at prbreaker.com to save yourself some money. Hit Point, the new protein powder, is coming out very, very soon. It's a milk protein isolate, 80% casein, 20% whey. So it's a protein blend. Go back and listen to the podcast. The last podcast I did with Derek Charleboy, the CEO of PR Breaker, we talked in detail about some unique research on protein intake and why blends tend to outperform pure whey or pure casein. So a whey casein blend tends to outperform whey alone or casein alone. It's interesting because you don't necessarily hear that marketed a lot. But as we talk about in this book, in this podcast, this book was written in 1996. And in the supplement section, Chris Aceto talks about, he's like, kind of nonchalantly at the time. He's like, it seems like a whey casein blend's better than just whey alone. So I kind of recommend that. And he's not the only one. I mean, there's multiple other people who've been talking about this for years, many years, decades, I guess, at this point. But whey is still really popular, and for good reason. I mean, whey is an amazing protein source. It's great, and it has that brand recognition, that name recognition. People know, I want protein, I want whey protein. It's almost like, hey, I want creatine monohydrate. There's been a lot of other creatine forms over the years that have been popular and promoted as better, but the research just doesn't show that, which is kind of interesting to protein, because you would think that maybe the protein blend model would be more popular. I mean, there's a few companies that do it. PE Science, they have a whey casein blend, and they talk about the research on why they decided to go that way. Back in the day, actually, one of my first years of being in the fitness industry, I was 17, 18, was doing personal training in the gym, started the initial website for Hunt Fitness at the time, and I was a distributor for a supplement company called Beverly International, and their proteins, they're really, really high quality, taste great. They have a product called Ultimate Muscle Protein, which is a protein blend, whey and casein blend, and this is like 10 years ago, and we were always promoting like, hey, do you realize that the blends tend to outperform just whey alone? That goes for around workouts, and for meals, it's kind of undisputed in terms of if you're having a protein powder as a meal replacement, you want a protein blend, not just 100% whey. Now, at the end of the day, if all you have available is whey, then it's better than nothing. It's still protein. And at the end of the day, total protein intake is what's most important. So really what we're talking about with timing all this shit, it's the little details. But hey, when we're looking to optimize stuff, the little details, some of the little details matter. Not all of them, but some of them. Especially when you have the option. It's like, hey, you're either going to buy one product A or product B. Well, what does the research show? Well, product B may be a little bit better. Well, shit, why don't we just spend our money there then, right? prbreaker.com, discount code HUNT10. Save yourself some money. Help support the Absolute Strength podcast. I want to get to the episode. Last but not least, if you're interested in coaching, I am a coach. Been coaching for the last 10 years, worked with hundreds of people, and I want to work with you if you're interested. If you are looking to take your training and nutrition to the next level, let's jump on a call. Let's talk about your goals. Let's talk about your history. Let's see if we'll be a good fit. There's more information about my coaching in the show notes, or just send me an email, kylehuntfitness@gmail.com. All right, let's get to the show. All right, we got the section on nutrition. There's some good stuff in here. Definitely some good information. But definitely going to be some commentary too. I mean, this is sets the stage here a little bit. This is the mid-90s. Mid to late 90s here. This is the heart of bodybuilding dogma nutrition. When you think of a bodybuilding diet, this is what we're going to be talking about. So picture that in your head. What do you think of when someone says a bodybuilding diet? Protein, obviously. Yeah, protein. Carbohydrates. Probably like a lot of bro foods. We don't really talk. Cool thing about this, we don't really talk much about foods. I mean, we do. He mentions it. I think probably purposely don't really spend a lot of time on it here. I don't plan on spending a lot of time on it, but he doesn't really spend that much time on it either, which is interesting. I think, sometimes people get caught up on the details of what you're doing, like in terms of the practice of what you're doing, the method of how you're getting there, but they don't really think about the principles. So in terms of nutrition here, it's like, okay, well, macronutrients, calorie intake, that's what's most important. And I think one of the issues with bodybuilding diets in the past, the bro bodybuilding diets, like when I first got into bodybuilding and fitness in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, a lot of emphasis was just placed on the food selection, but not enough emphasis was placed on the macronutrient composition. So calorie intake, protein intake, carbohydrate intake, fat intake, at the end of the day, was minimized and overemphasized was, hey, you got to eat this meal here, this meal at this time, exactly this meal at that time, et cetera, et cetera. Here we go. Here's your day. That's how you have a good diet. Where then flexible dieting became popular and was, hold on, let's take a step back here. But what's good about this is, like I said, mid-90s this was written, and we talk a lot about macronutrients here. So let's dig in. The first talk actually in the nutrition section isn't even about nutrition. It's about cardio. To the book. In a way, aerobic exercise and what you eat are inseparable, as for the most part, bodybuilders who try to alter their eating habits to control body fat also tend to include some type of aerobic exercise to limit the accumulation of fat stores. That was a long sentence. Thus, when trying to get lean, it's difficult to discuss nutrition strategies without including aerobic exercise. So essentially what he's saying here is, hey, cardio and fat loss and nutrition kind of all go hand in hand. Continued. Aerobic work is a must for pre-contest bodybuilders. Aerobics use fat for a fuel source, which allows a bodybuilder to get really ripped. To be a great bodybuilder, you have to maximize your training sessions by making them as demanding as possible. Likewise, you should maximize your aerobic work by reaching and maintaining your individual target heart rate. And that's why, this is really why I wanted to read this directly from the book, Target Heart Rate. To the book. Target heart rate is the number of beats the heart should be in 1 minute in order to ensure the body is tapping as much fat and burning as many calories as possible. Numerically, target heart rate can be found by subtracting your age from 220 and multiplying the number by 0.65 to 0.75, which represents 65 to 75% of its maximum. All right, so what Chris is talking about here is target heart rate. And what he gets into, I'm pretty sure what he's talking about is quote unquote a fat burning zone. This is what was talked about, moderate, 65 to 75% of your target heart rate. That's a fat burning zone. I actually really like targeted heart rate cardio, but not because we're trying to get any fat burning zone or anything like that. I just like using your heart rate to almost like is a percentage of how we would use training. Like, okay, we want to do a 5x5 at 75% of our 1 rep max. Well, we can do the same idea with targeting our heart rate in terms of cardio prescription. And I like using heart rate. And really, 65 to 75% is a pretty good range for that higher low intensity cardio, which, technically it's probably like moderate intensity, but I just kind of group moderate in low together, which we can talk about in more detail why and we actually do talk about in more detail why that's not always the best case, but it really depends on how you're setting it up. But we'll definitely dig into that a little bit more. But what I'm talking about here is, so target heart rate. Just a general formula, 220 minus your age gives you your maximum heart rate. Of course, this is an approximate here. We're not getting very too specific here. So if you're 20 years old, your maximum heart rate would be 200. So then what you would do is you'd multiply that by 0.65 to 0.75, get your, that zone 65 to 75%, and that's what we would shoot for during a cardio session. And when I prescribe this, I don't really look at it to be too crazy about it. Like, I don't need you to constantly be checking your heart rate monitor and this and that. Really, it's just an approximate. And really, I like to just prescribe that so you have an idea of how hard you should be doing your cardio. Because, again, when you just prescribe a number, you say, okay, I want you to do 20 minutes of low-intensity cardio. Depending on how the person perceives that, you could be getting two completely different training effects. Option one would be, oh, you want me to do 20 minutes of just low-intensity cardio, and you see them on a treadmill holding on to the treadmill and just barely even moving. It's like, oh, well, I guess that's low intensity. And then on the flip side, you see, someone's like, oh, okay, cool. I'll put it on the treadmill at the highest incline, walk as absolute fast as I possibly can, or even run, and then, that's my low-intensity cardio. So those are widely different. I'm not saying one way really necessarily is better than the other per se. I mean, within reason. It depends on the person and their goals. But we got to put a number to it. Now, some people just do the calorie method. So you could prescribe, instead of prescribing a time domain and a heart rate range to stay within plus or minus a little bit, they'll just say, just burn 200 calories worth of cardio. And that works. That definitely works. And it may even be a little bit easier for most people. I mean, you got to take the word of the machine. So what you'll do is you'll put in your age, weight, sometimes your height as well into the machine, and then it gives you an approximate calorie consumption or calorie burn, calorie expenditure during your cardio session. That works, but the reason why I actually like heart rate a little bit better is really because as you get more conditioned, you become more efficient at the movement. So, you just improve. You get better. And the heart rate will reflect that. Your heart rate will drop. So in order to stay within the range, as you get more conditioned to the cardio that you're doing, you have to increase the amount of effort you're doing. So you're walking faster, increasing the incline, increasing how fast you're doing the stairs, increasing the resistance on the bike or resistance on the elliptical, whatever. As you improve at the movement, you have to improve the increase the intensity to stay within the heart rate range. Now, as you get more conditioned and become more efficient, the machine, really the only thing that'll be changing is your body weight will be going down a little bit. But you can get in better aerobic shape without really your body weight not changing that much. You know what I'm saying? So you could lose 5 pounds, 3 pounds, and your aerobic capacity went up quite a bit. So the cardio is not getting the same effect. And then, of course, the other issue is the machines. How accurate are the machines? So again, there's multiple methods here, but I just wanted to point out the fact that he mentions using target heart rate, and I really like that method as well. Okay, so moving on. Bodybuilding nutrition. So the next section. Clearly, nutrition plays a major role in not only building lean body mass, but shedding body fat. The foods we eat provide the fuel muscles require to do the work to stimulate growth in the first place via hard training, and food is the raw ingredients that allow the muscles to adapt and lay down new muscle tissue. Like training, bodybuilders often make nutrition far more complicated than it really has to be. In an attempt to devise some super high-tech training or nutrition plan, many skip the basics, the real secrets to successful bodybuilding. Moving on. I strongly suggest that you weigh all the food you eat. This will allow you to take control of your diet and master it like a professional. Most people do not know the total amount of calories, carbs, protein, and fat they are consuming in any given day. Weighing allows you to make accurate and minor adjustments to initiate the fat burning process or to inhibit fat storage. Bodybuilders who often claim to eat 6,000 calories a day don't. They miscalculate their caloric intake. Likewise, those who find losing fat very difficult often eat more than they believe. Weighing food in logs gives you accurate numbers, feedback, and direction, allowing you to build the ideal nutrition plan. Okay, so really good stuff here. Really, really good stuff. Weighing and measuring, and then talks about most people don't really have a very good idea of what they're eating. And that's really why I recommend weighing and measuring, at least initially. Really, that's the principles of flexible dieting. I mean, you set your calories, you set your macronutrients, and then you weigh and measure your food to hit those numbers. But really, the weighing and the measuring, I think, is the real skill developed. Weighing and measuring your food. Because what that teaches you, that teaches you way more than almost anything else about nutrition, is actually weighing and measuring your food, looking at serving sizes, looking at nutrition labels. Like, there's a lot to be said of just tracking your macros, weighing and measuring your food for a couple weeks. And once we get to a point, and this is what I do with a lot of my clients, depending on the goals. If you have aggressive goals, and weighing and measuring is what you need to do, because I think that's the best method. But we only want to make nutrition and training really as difficult as we need it to be. So if someone doesn't have super aggressive fat loss goals, for the most part, after we weigh and measure strictly for a month or two, probably even less than that, probably about a month, and once you get comfortable and you feel like you're in control, we can loosen up the grasp a little bit. We can start just tracking calories and protein, letting carbs and fats fall where they weigh, and it just makes things easier, makes consistency easier, which at the end of the day is what we're going for. We want this to be as easy as possible to be consistent for as long as possible. What he mentions here towards the end is actually been shown in research. Most people who are overweight, they underestimate how much they're actually eating. And it's very easy to do. It's very easy. It's very easy to forget the calories. And that's even if you know a rough estimate of what food that you eat has caloric-wise. If you have no idea, then you're just guessing at that point. You have no basis, and that's really most Americans, most of the general population. When you think about it, if you had to ask them how many calories you eat in a day, they're just picking a number. They have no idea. They have no idea. Where are they getting the numbers from? What they've heard on TV, what they remember from high school health class or something. They're just going to guess a random number. And then again, and when people start dieting, maybe start getting a little bit of nutrition information, they're like, man, I can't lose weight. I can't lose weight. No matter what I'm doing, I can't lose weight. Well, if you can't lose weight, that means you're not in a caloric deficit. That means we either need to create a greater deficit by reducing the amount of food you're eating or increasing your caloric expenditure, so get you moving a little bit more. Losing weight, very, very simple. Eat less, move more. There's a lot more that goes into that, but in trying to achieve that, but that's what we need to do. And it's been shown in research that most people that are overweight, just they don't think they're eating as much. And whether that's from just a complete lack of knowledge, or maybe that's from, hey, here's my plan, here's my fad diet that I tried, but that doesn't include the snacks throughout the day, doesn't include all the other little things that we're having. Then on the flip side, you also have the people who are the quote-unquote hard gainers that say, oh, no matter, I've tried everything, no matter what, I can't gain any weight, I'm eating so much food. Are you? Are you really eating so much food? Are you really eating as many calories as you think you are? Probably not. Probably not. Again, it's to gain muscle, to gain weight, the same formula. And that's why it's so easy for people to gain weight, because it's easier to eat more calories, in my opinion, just because, especially in this day and age, because foods are so highly palatable, it's just easy for us to overconsume calories. There's no shortage of food. Most of the foods we do eat, we go to the grocery store, pick out, taste amazing. It's just very easy to overconsume them. But for the people who maybe don't have as big of an appetite, and they're trying to build muscle, and they're eating quote unquote bodybuilding foods, chicken, rice, vegetables, which is, hey, that's a great diet to be on. But when you're trying to build muscle, sometimes especially if you have a high metabolic capacity and you can, it takes 3,500, 4,000 calories for you to gain any size. Hey, we might have to include some liquid calories. You might have to include some just Gatorade. That's one of my favorite things. Like, hey, you can't gain weight? Okay, well, cool. Just throw a couple scoops of protein powder into a big thing of Gatorade and just drink that. Then that's where I think kind of that same idea is where the gallon of milk a day diet came from. I mean, that just saying that makes me feel like it would tear my stomach apart. But I think that was the idea. You drink a gallon of milk a day, a gallon of whole milk a day, you're getting like, I think it's like 128 grams of fat, 128 grams of protein, probably, I don't know, there's more carbs than per 8 ounces than fat or protein. So even more carbs per day. You're getting a shitload of calories from if you drink a gallon of milk a day. I don't recommend that. I'm just saying that right now. I don't recommend that. But using that same idea of, okay, you want to gain size, how can we increase liquid calories? Having protein powder and quick digesting carbs like a Gatorade that provides a ton of calories, ton of carbohydrates, and not much feelings of fullness is the way to go. All right, so moving on here. The baseline reference diet. And this is kind of where he starts to talk about developing a nutrition plan. And when he says baseline reference diet, really what he's talking about is maintenance caloric intake. To find the baseline diet or caloric maintenance, he recommends tracking your current intake for a few days and seeing what you're currently consuming. I mean, I actually personally really, really like this method. I mean, that's the most accurate way. I mean, if we want to find, and really when I work with clients and we're trying to find caloric maintenance, I mean, yeah, I have some formulas that I created that I think are pretty accurate just from working with a lot of people and kind of morphing all the formulas that there are available. I can get pretty close just by knowing body weight, activity level, looking at pictures, and etc. But the best way, the absolute best way, is just to have you track your food for a few days or a week, see what you're eating, and then weigh yourself too, and look at it and analyze things that way. I mean, really the truth is, I mean, most of the calculators, they're just averages, so they're not going to be very specific to you. I mean, especially if you're an outlier. But they can give you a decent starting point. So really the starting point is not that big of a deal. Where you start is not that important. I think, again, people get too caught up in their starting numbers when really it's, yeah, you want an educated starting point. But really what happens is once you get started, then you just make adjustments. I mean, that's really the key. I mean, that's really the key with nutrition. That's the key with nutrition coaching is just timely adjustments. Timely and accurate adjustments are what's really important. So you get started on a diet, and then you sit back and look and see what the data shows. What's your body weight doing? How's your performance in the gym? What are you looking like? How are you feeling? And then you make adjustments from there. That's the key. That's the real key. And I think that's probably the thing that most people mess up. I mean, that's where if a nutrition coach messes up, it's not the starting point because it doesn't matter. You can start anywhere. It doesn't matter where. I really want to emphasize this point because it doesn't matter. If you understand nutrition, and you understand how progress is made, you can start someone anywhere, and within a couple of weeks, you can get it figured out. Hopefully that makes sense. What I'm saying is, so let's say you came to me and you're like, Kyle, I want you to coach me on nutrition, but here's the deal. I already figured out my starting point, so I already got my starting diet. I would say, okay, cool, great, we'll start there. Cool, let's see, then I have my way of tracking your progress, and within a week or two, I'll have all the data I need to make an adjustment. And then by week 2, we'll have you dialed in. You could start terrible. By week 2, we'll have you dialed in completely. And I think and then by week 4, we'll probably, either if things are going well, then we'll keep going. And by week 8, then week 12, I mean, all these different things, it's just those adjustments to make sure you're losing weight at the rate you want to, or gaining weight at the rate you want to, whatever your goals are, and then just making those adjustments to stay within that range. So you don't ever, I mean, when you do it this way, you take it by a week-by-week approach, or a really every other week, every 2-week approach, that's how you stay on track. That's how you don't really get far behind. Because if you plan ahead of time, you plan in the beginning of what you need to do, where you need to get at the end, and what you need to do to get there, it really all just comes down to execution. I mean, you got to have a good plan. You don't want to have it open-ended where it's like, oh, I don't really know what I need to do. I don't really know what my weekly weight loss needs to be, or I don't really know what my monthly weight loss needs to be. That's just a recipe for disaster, because then you don't know if you're at a good starting point. You might diet too strictly off the bat. If you only need to lose 10 pounds and you're on a diet after 3 weeks, you've lost 7, it's like, well, man, maybe we're just being a little too aggressive with this, you know? And especially if you're struggling, like I can't barely hang on to this anymore. Like I just feel like my training's going down. I have no energy. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we put you on too strict of a diet right off the bat. That's probably my biggest complaint with most lower carb or keto diets is you just start too low and then your body adapts and you don't really have any place to go. And we're going to talk about this in a later section here on how even higher carb diets can present that same problem. All right. So although his method for creating the baseline diet is just, and I like it, it's what I recommend, his reasoning is pretty much straight out of a bro science textbook, if there was one. Back to the book. One reason diets do not work is because the person starting the diet never had a reference point diet. Okay, what's he talking about here? When he reduces calories, his body is stubborn to give up fat as fuel. The reason is because some days he had been eating more, and some days a lot less, and on other days he ate in the middle of the road amount of calories. The body therefore refuses to respond to the diet. All right, so what he explains here, what he's saying is let's say you eat an average of 3,000 calories per day, but you eat 2,300 one day, 2,800 another day, 3,800 the next day, 2,000 another day. The body won't respond to the deficit because your calories are all over the place. Yeah, that was his reasoning, okay? Interesting. I don't know if I've ever really heard anybody explain it like that. But the truth is, the body will always respond to a deficit as long as you allow enough time to take shape. So, I mean, within a week, yeah, so let's say you're eating all over the place, and then you determine that about 3,000 calories is your daily caloric average intake, your maintenance intake. You create a deficit. Maybe after 1 week, you don't see any progress. But usually it takes more than 1 week to actually get a good, accurate representation of where the diet's actually at. Within 2 weeks or within 3 weeks, if you're in a deficit, it's going to reflect that you were in a deficit. By definition, if you're in a deficit, you're going to see weight loss. If you're not, well, then guess what? Maybe 3,000 calories wasn't really your maintenance intake. Maybe because your calories were so all over the place that really there wasn't enough data to actually come up with an average. Maybe you needed 2 weeks worth of, because your diet was, which for the most part in practice, I don't ever remember seeing any case where most people eat pretty close to what they're eating all the time. However, sometimes people will eat really strict during the week and then kind of have blowouts in the weekends. That can make it a little bit difficult to create a starting point. But you don't usually see people eating all over the place like every day. Like one day super high, next day low, next day in the middle, next day super high, low, you don't see that. Most people are creatures of habit. And they eat damn near the same thing every day. I mean, most people are on that consistency whether they know it or not. It's just their consistency isn't directed to their goals. Yeah, so really the point here is, look, if you're in a deficit and you allow a diet enough time to take shape, you're in a deficit. If the body doesn't lose weight after a few weeks, then you weren't in a deficit, so you got to make an adjustment. Interesting that he talks about how he explains that. I don't know. I don't really know where he got that. All right, next up, protein needs. A custom nutrition plan is based on your reference calories found using a baseline diet, along with the protein needs. So, yeah, calories, protein, most important. Protein, along with total energy, carbs to a lesser degree than dietary fat, exist in a dynamic relationship. That is, the more total calories you eat, the less the body relies on protein as fuel. When calories are kept high and eaten in abundance, protein needs tend to go down, and when calories fall while trying to get ripped, protein needs will increase. And that's true for the most part, but not quite as much as he would explain. But yeah, when you're in a diet and you're in an extreme deficit, protein needs definitely go up. And when you're in a big surplus, protein needs do go down. But we're talking a small range. So the range I typically recommend is between 0.8 and 1.2 grams per pound of body weight. So 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, 1.2 grams per pound of body weight. So when you're in a very severe deficit, we'll probably be closer to that 1.2. When you're in a big surplus, you can be closer to that 0.8. Now, what's really convenient is 1 gram per pound of body weight falls smack dab in the middle of that range. So for the most part, just to make it very easy for people, the 1 gram per pound of body weight is just a good number. Now, in the book, Chris recommends 1 to 1.5 grams per pound of lean body mass. Now, if you really want to get down to the brass tacks, so to speak, the best actual recommendation for protein would be based off from lean body mass, really. But there's a couple problems there. One, most people don't have a really good idea of what their lean body mass is. They don't really have an idea of what their body fat intake or the body fat composition really is. So, I mean, you're just kind of estimating lean body mass. So if we're just estimating, well, then we might as well just use body weight for the most part. Now, the reason lean body mass tends to be a more accurate representation is because when you are dealing with really heavy people with a higher body fat percentage, you don't need to go 1 gram per pound of body weight. So if someone's really overweight and weighs 350 pounds, they probably most likely don't need 350 grams of protein. So using a lean body mass number would be more accurate for them. But for most people, again, if you're outside the a range of what you would consider normal, I guess. So if you're a big outlier, then yeah, the 1 gram per pound of body weight won't work for you. But for most people, under probably even up to maybe 25% body fat, it does. So if you're over 25% body fat, you would probably just want to be on that lower side of the number. But during a fat loss diet, having a little bit more protein, there is some benefits there. Mostly, really for two main reasons. One, protein has the highest thermic effect of eating. So when you eat more protein, it actually has a higher thermic effect. The amount of calories it takes to eat, absorb, and assimilate protein. Not huge, but there is a little bit higher than fat and carbohydrates. And then more importantly is protein has the highest response to creating fullness. So when you eat more protein, you tend, especially during a fat loss diet, it helps you feel more full versus carbohydrates and fats. Now, back to the book. He recommends 1 to 1.5 grams per pound of lean body mass, but he also doesn't recommend tracking protein that doesn't come from protein sources. So, to the book, direct quote, "There is no need to count the protein found outside of complete sources. Don't count the protein found in carbs like rice, oatmeal, pasta, bread, etc." Okay, so what he's saying is, essentially, you'll just count the protein from like meat, eggs, and protein powder, things like that. So protein found in non-complete sources, so food items that aren't a complete source of protein containing all essential amino acids, you wouldn't count. And I don't agree with that. I mean, for example, 1 cup, so about 80 grams of oats, has 10 grams of protein. A cup of rice has 5 grams of protein. Bread has, you have a couple slices of bread, you're getting a handful of protein. I mean, all these little numbers will add up. I mean, if you have a cup of oats in the morning, 2 cups of rice throughout the day, and a couple slices of bread, you're easily at like 25 grams of protein, 25, 30 grams of protein just from your carb sources. That's a significant amount. That's a significant amount of calories there. If you don't count the protein, then you're just not counting those calories. But that does kind of make sense because 1 to 1.5 grams per pound of lean body mass is probably a little bit low when, I'm saying 0.8 to 1.2 per pound of body weight. So 1 to 1.5 pounds grams per pound of lean body mass would be a smaller number. So if you're not counting the grams of protein from carb sources, I mean, really, you just be, it's one of those things where you're getting more protein than what your goal is, but your goal is set low, if that makes sense. So it kind of, his numbers are set low, I think maybe just because he recognizes the fact that, well, we're going to be getting more protein because he's not going to count the protein from the carb sources. But I don't recommend that. I mean, I don't. I just think you should count everything. Count the protein from your branched chain amino acid supplementation. I think that's something that people don't recognize because according to the FDA, you don't have, a supplement company does not have to put on the label that because amino acids, so like branched chain amino acids, are not a full spectrum of amino acids, it's literally just, it's free form amino acids, you don't have to put that it has any calories. You don't have to put that it's actually grams of protein. I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, but back when I worked or sold supplements, was a distributor for Beverly International, I was 17, 18 years old, 2 products they recommend. One, the liver tabs, and then they had a amino acid, I think it was kind of just like a branched chain amino acid pill, but it maybe had a couple other amino acids in there too, not just the branched chains. So they would recommend taking the liver tabs, and I think they call them like maybe mass aminos or something, I can't remember, but recommend taking a couple of those with each meal. And each tablet of the liver tabs was a gram of protein. And then I think maybe the mass aminos were a gram of protein too. So even if you just, and they recommended taking like 2, 3, 4 per meal. So if you're taking, just let's say 2, you're eating 4 times a day, you take 2 per meal, you're getting that just an extra 8 grams of protein from pills essentially. Again, not a huge amount, but 8 grams a day, 7 days a week, every day for a month. I mean, that's consider amount of calories. Then on top of that, let's say you're taking fish oil. Say you're taking a couple fish oil tabs per day. Each fish oil tabs, depending on the amount of fish oil in there, it's about a gram of fat per fish oil. Adds up. Now, I will say this. If for something like fish oil, I don't always recommend, or I don't always like harp on the fact that you have to track something like fish oil because if it's a constant like fish oil, let's say you take 2 fish oil tabs, so it's 2 grams of fat, but you take it every single day. Well, it's just a constant. So when we adjust the other things in the diet, I mean, the fish oils, yeah, it's 2 grams of fat, but if you're just taking 2 grams of fat every single day, it's not as important, but, yeah, I just wanted to recognize the fact that it is calories. Another thing is cooking spray. Cooking spray is calorie-free if you barely even use any. So, for example, myself, I use cooking spray. Pretty much the only time I use cooking spray is in the morning when I make my eggs. So I don't track it, but I recognize the fact that, yeah, I'm probably getting some fat from my cooking spray. But I use it every single day, very consistent with that, and it's just a constant. So, I mean, it's just one of those things. It's not 100% accurate, but pretty much whenever we're tracking calories and tracking macronutrients, it's never going to be 100% accurate. The nutrition labels aren't 100% accurate. So there's this healthy balance we have to have. Healthy balance between, okay, we want to be as accurate as possible and track everything as accurately as possible. But then we also don't want to get too hung up on the small little details because, hey, the nutrition labels themselves aren't 100% accurate. They can estimate on the nutrition labels. That's an important point to recognize. But I will say this too. I'm kind of talking in circles here, but I've heard people use that as an excuse for why you shouldn't track and measure your foods. People say, "Oh, well, because the nutrition labels are estimated anyways." Now that's a stupid answer. I'm sorry. That's a stupid reason for not tracking your food is because the nutrition labels aren't 100% accurate. Yeah, they're not 100% accurate, but they're damn close. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because the nutrition labels aren't 100% accurate doesn't mean that nothing's important. It's just, hey, recognize the fact that you might actually have an extra gram or 2 of fat per day plus or minus than what the nutrition label shows. That's why really when we're tracking macros, you just need a range, plus or minus 5 to 10 grams is well within the realm of 100% accurate. So if you're within 5 to 10 grams of your macronutrients, I consider that you hit your diet 100% that day. And really that's the room for error on food labels and tracking errors. Oh, you supposed to weigh out 80 grams, you weighed out 85. Little things like that. That's why the range is what's important. Be very consistent with it, consistently hitting the range. That's what's more important than being super caught up on trying to be 100% accurate and flipping out if you're not 100% accurate. It's kind of the same thing goes with vegetables too. People say, oh, don't track your veggies. I recommend tracking your veggies. Because there's calories in it. Same idea with why people will say, well, don't track or just track net carbs, not total carbs. Well, net carbs, so subtracting things like fiber from your carbohydrate sources or things like sugar alcohols from your fiber or your carbohydrate sources to create a net carbohydrate. Well, the downside to that is that shows, or that would mean that sugar alcohols and fiber contain 0 calories. Now, fiber might not contain 4 grams or 4 calories per gram like all the other carbohydrates, but fiber absolutely has calories. So just for ease of calculation, I just recommend calculating total calories or total carbohydrates, not net carbohydrates. It just makes it too complicated. Because if you want it to be accurate, okay, well then what you really should do is not track net carbs. What you should track is, okay, well, fiber isn't 4 calories per gram. It's also not 0 calories, but it might be around 2 calories per gram. So now you got to do a whole separate calculation. Just getting crazy with it. At that point. Next up, carbohydrates. He talks a lot about, in the carbohydrate section, a lot about insulin. Again, back in the day, that's a lot more emphasis. People still talk about insulin, though. As surprising as it is, I think sometimes people get the idea in their head, insulin somehow, irrespective of total caloric intake, drives fat gaining. Insulin, if you are in a caloric surplus and have elevated insulin levels, insulin is very anabolic. It stores things. It stores glycogen. It helps push things into storage. So, when calories are abundant, insulin, it could potentially help build, but think of it this way. It's very anabolic, so it can help build muscle, but also store body fat too. There's a reason why bodybuilders who, enhanced bodybuilders will use insulin. It's very dangerous too. Very dangerous. But that I just want to bring that up. He talks a lot about insulin. We're going to skip a lot of the talk on insulin just because it's not relevant. But digging in here, carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the primary fuel source during weight training. They provide you with energy to train hard. If you do not eat a sufficient amount of carbs, you'll lack the Class A fuel required to train hard enough to stimulate the body to lay down new muscle tissue. And a mass-building diet that is too low in carbs will cause protein to be used as fuel, leaving your muscles, quote-unquote, protein-starved without the raw building blocks, amino acids, to help repair and grow. All right, so first off, he talks about carbohydrates being the primary fuel source for training, which in the first episode when he talked about energy systems, he talks about this, and quick little recap: energy systems, ATP, creatine phosphate, and then the glycolytic system. During the glycolytic system, using glycogen and glucose for energy, where do they come from? Carbohydrates. And really, when we're talking about resistance training, carbohydrates do play a big role in energy for resistance training, as they do in endurance training as well. And there is something to be said for, hey, when we are consuming enough carbohydrates, our training is going to be better. Our resistance training is going to be better. And this is one of the reasons why, me personally, and we're going to get into this in the book, I tend to like to keep carbs high with clients. I've just found over the years that most people respond better to lower fat, caloric restricted diets. So protein during a really protein needs are always going to stay constant, whether we're building muscle, whether we're losing fat. Like I said, yeah, they're going to change a little bit. As Chris Aceto points out in the book, that, yeah, when you're in a big deficit, your protein needs to go up. When you're in a big surplus, the protein needs to go down a little bit. But within that range, your protein needs are always going to be within that range, right around 1 gram per pound of body weight, plus or minus. That's going to be the average that we're always going to be around. But as calories go up and down, carbohydrates and fats, they have a huge range. And also depending on what style of caloric restricted diet you're doing. Are you going low carb or are you going low fat? Now, when you're going low carb, to me, I find from a resistance training, can people do it? Yeah, absolutely. People can go low carb and still gain strength, still build muscle, still have plenty of energy to train. It's not like you're going to go low carb or go keto and then all of a sudden you have no energy to train. You still will. But I've found that people who are able to diet on higher carbohydrates tend to keep performance better than people who choose really to diet on lower carbohydrates. And that's what I've found in 10 years of coaching. And even when you look at the research, there's really not much difference between low carb and low fat in terms of effectiveness. Really, when protein and calories are equated, carbohydrate and fat intake can go up and down, and really it just comes down to adherence. So what do you like better? Do you personally like to diet on higher fat or higher carbohydrates? Me, as soon as I cut carbohydrates, even if just from a psychological standpoint, as soon as I cut carbohydrates, I feel like I'm dieting. I could be in a caloric surplus, but if you cut my carbohydrates, I feel like I'm dieting. But that's just what I enjoy. Like, my personal preference is I like to have carbohydrates high. But I've also seen that having carbohydrates high tends to work better for most people. So maybe I'm just biased in that sense. Probably am. But I've used a lot of lower carb diets for people too. I've utilized a lot of lower carb diets. And for an individual that enjoys eating higher fat foods and carbohydrates aren't as exciting for them, then shit, if you can be more consistent on lower carbs, and that's what we'll do. All these things are just tools in the toolbox, but there is something to be said for carbohydrates being a better fuel source for resistance training than going lower carb with higher fats. Next up, meal timing. So we talked a little bit about meal timing here. Eat 5 to 6 times a day. Okay, back to the book. Smaller meals spread out over the day, usually every 2.5 to 3 hours, allows you to eat lesser amount of carbs at any one meal. Carbs are the chief releaser of insulin. Too many carbs eaten at one sitting will cause an elevated spike in insulin, which can contribute to fat storage, especially in those who struggle to maintain lower levels of body fat. So here we go. We're talking about insulin again. 5 to 6 meals a day not only provides the body with a constant supply of protein for growth, but smaller meals modify insulin output, which can potentially lead to a leaner yet more muscular physique. Okay, so meal timing. Talking about insulin, talking about somehow increased meal frequency leading to a leaner physique, that's just not the case. This just hasn't been shown to be the case. When it comes to meal timing, really what we found is 3 to 6 meals a day. 3 to 6, somewhere within 3 to 6 meals a day tends to be best. Again, it comes down to personal preference. Would you rather have 3 bigger meals or 6 smaller meals? Within 3 to 6, not much difference. Now, there is something to be said. Again, if you want to optimize your results, if we're looking to optimize everything, there is some research that actually supports more protein feeding spread throughout the day is better than less. So really, when we're talking outside of this 3 to 6 window, so really what we're saying is 3 protein feedings per day is better than 1. So you can have 200 grams of protein in one meal, or you can spread 200 grams of protein out throughout 3 to 4 meals. The 3 to 4 meals are going to outperform the 1 meal. That's what research has shown. Is it a big deal? Well, take it for a grain of salt. At the end of the day, how many grams of protein you're eating at the end of the day is going to be what's most important. But again, with something like this, hey, if we can optimize things a little bit, and there is some research to show that it is better, why not try it? Why not do that? And probably 2 meals would be better than 1. So if you're only eating one, well, why don't we just try two? And spread out a few hours apart and see how that works. I mean, plus eating 200 grams of protein or even 150 grams of protein in one meal would be pretty difficult. The 1 meal a day thing was originally, way back in the day, was promoted by the Warrior Diet. And that was kind of one of the first rebirths of intermittent fasting. And I think that book came out maybe in the late 90s. That would actually be, I didn't put that on my list, but that would actually be an interesting book to talk about. I actually didn't like it. I read it last year, year before, just because I was curious and I had never read it. I actually didn't really like it that much, but it would be an interesting book to go over because he talks about a lot of bro science in that. A lot of shit that has no real science behind it. But we could definitely have fun with that one, the Warrior Diet. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm putting it on the list. Damn it, I am putting the Warrior Diet on the list. I'm going to have fun with that book. I'm going to have fun tearing that one apart. But that was like the book that I will give it credit. It got people thinking about intermittent fasting again. Because intermittent fasting is not a new thing. And even before the Warrior Diet, it wasn't a new thing. But that was what really kind of rebirthed it. And as I've talked about before, a lot of things with nutrition, a lot of things with fitness in general, but specifically nutrition, it's just a cycle, Like something will be very popular, kind of fall out of favor, something else will come up, and then whatever was popular 10 years ago comes back around. Keto does this every 10 years. Intermittent fasting does it every 10 years. But after the Warrior Diet, one of the things that I think made it more user-friendly, so to speak, is when Martin Berkham of Lean Gains came out with the 16-8 model. And really what that model was is you would eat about 3 meals a day within your 8-hour window. So it was, I don't know if he really ever used this. He probably would use other research to support why it was beneficial, but not the actual multiple protein feedings throughout the day research, although maybe he did. I can't really remember. But it was a little bit more effective for people who lifted weights. You would eat more protein or protein spread throughout the day more frequently. And again, I think just partly that 16-8 model works very well for most people. It works more from a practical side because it's easy just to skip breakfast and then eat lunch and then have a snack and then eat dinner. Like that's doable. Like you can fit that around your schedule. And also it works well from a social standpoint because most people don't really have social breakfasts. If they do, it's just kind of like a coffee get together or something. And it's easy just to not eat anything with it, just have some coffee at a coffee shop or something. But dinner is like the big thing. That's a big social event. Most people have dinners. And I think that's partly why intermittent fasting works well is because if you cut out calories in the first half of the day, what that does is it allows you to have more calories later on. It's still a calorie equation, but if you're having more calories later on in the day, it can kind of make you feel like you're not dieting. So if it works for someone's schedule, yeah, the mornings can be difficult, but once you get used to it, it's not that bad. But I still recommend more protein feedings throughout the day. And there's nothing magical about intermittent fasting. I eat breakfast. I eat my consistent meals every morning. If you follow me on Instagram at Home Fitness, you see that. Obviously, I don't do intermittent fasting. I've had clients who do it. If it works for your schedule, we do it. If not, then we don't. It's not anything more to it. But the idea that eating more frequently, eating 6 times a day, it was a bodybuilding myth, one of the most popular bodybuilding myths. And a lot of it had to do with that thermic effect of eating that we talked about. People thought that, if you eat more frequently, it increases your thermic effect of the meal and it helps you stay lean and lose body fat. When in reality, I think a lot of that came from is just your body adapts to almost everything. It adapts very, very well. And when you start eating more frequently, what happens is your body starts to get hungry more frequently. So hunger isn't directly related to metabolic function. So you will get hungry more frequently. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, I'm getting hungry more frequently, so that means I'm burning more calories. I'm becoming more metabolically efficient or something like that. No, at the end of the day, the thermic effect of feeding is about overall calories and macronutrient composition, not how many times or how small the meals were and how frequently you ate them. So within reason, within the 3 to 6 range, really it's about personal preference. Would you rather have 3 meals a day or 6 meals a day? Within that, not much different. Outside of that, yeah, there may be some downsides to having less than 3 meals a day, and there actually may be some downsides to eating more than 6 meals a day. I mean, if you start eating 8 and start spreading out your protein intake from 8 to 10 meals or something, I mean, there is a refractory period where you might just be consuming protein too frequently even. So again, these are small details. At the end of the day, it's what the numbers are what's most important. But when we're looking to optimize things, when there is some concrete data to show one thing is better than the other, it's worth our time to look into it. Next up, he talks about making breakfast the biggest carbohydrate meal of the day. When there are few carbs in the bloodstream, you have not eaten for 8 to 10 hours, and muscle glycogen is not saturated, carbohydrates have a tendency to first satisfy and replenish muscle glycogen reserves and elevate low blood sugar levels before having the potential to affect body fat storage. In other words, a large amount of carbohydrates consumed under a near fasted state will be stored as muscle glycogen, the carbohydrate fuel reserves located within muscles before having the ability to be packed away as body fat. So what he's saying is have the most carbohydrates in the morning. Well, I mean, what he said is correct there, but there's not really a great need for carbohydrates at really any particular time during the day. Besides, I mean, there is benefit to having carbohydrates pre-training, I mean, to help fuel the training performance. And then if you're going to have, so I actually think pre-training is probably more important than post-training, but then bookending the training session with some protein post-training and maybe a little bit of carbs, maybe even pushing a little bit more carbs during those pre- and post-training meals than at other times would be beneficial. And he talks about that here next, is making the post-training meal the second biggest carbohydrate meal. I mean, I think there's something to be said for, like I said, putting carbohydrates around training, but pre-training and post-training. Breakfast, I mean, for me, the reason I don't personally like to make my breakfast and have clients' breakfast the highest carbohydrate meal of the day is I found a lot of people aren't hungry first thing in the morning. So why would we put a ton of calories and carbohydrates into the morning meal when I find most people tend to get hungry at nighttime? Like most people, when they break on their diet, it's at night. So me, personally, I like to shift more of our calories and carbohydrates to later in the day, actually have one of our last meals of the day higher carbohydrate than our breakfast meal, just because from a practical standpoint, I think that works better. Now, there's a reason why he doesn't recommend this. And it leads us to one of, if not probably the biggest miss in bodybuilding back in the day. Back to the book. I'm a believer that carbs eaten at night have an easier chance to stimulate fat storage than those eaten at any other time of the day, unless you are training at night and the final meal of the day happens to be the post-training meal. So what he's saying here is carbs eaten at night have an easier chance to stimulate fat storage. So carbs at night make you fat, which was that was one of the biggest bodybuilding nutrition myths that I guess, I don't know if it's still a thing. I think maybe subconsciously it's still a thing for people. They feel like if they eat carbohydrates at night, they're going to get fat, and it leads to more fat storage than any other point. And it makes sense. I mean, if you think of it from like a common sense standpoint, it's like, oh, well, carbs fuel training, carbs provide energy. If I'm going to sleep, all these carbs are not going to be used, not going to be burned off. I'm just going to store them as fat. But really, at the end of the day, again, it comes down to caloric intake. So if we're still in a deficit, it doesn't matter if we're having our carbs right before bed or first thing in the morning. The details, the differences there are going to be very, very small. Again, at night, people tend, from a social standpoint and just from maybe just throughout the day, they've kind of worn down their discipline, worn down their ability to, I don't know, just kind of stick to the diet. At nighttime tends to be the hardest point for people to maintain diet. So what we do is a method to kind of circumvent that is we add more calories later in the day. So if this helps us be more consistent, if this helps us stick to the diet better, then that's what we're going to do. And it's been shown that eating carbs at night doesn't lead to more fat storage. So that one's kind of been put to bed, but it still comes up. Now, I will say, let's say you have a big dinner, pretty big dinner, like 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, and then right before bed, you're hungry and you have another meal right before bed. Well, you know what? If you were going to cut carbs from any meal, it would make sense to have that meal a little bit lower carbohydrate. And the only reason is because if you really want to optimize things and have a meal before bed, a perfect meal would be something high in protein, something in ideally slower digestion protein, something like a whey casein blend maybe, or even some Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, something like that, with a fat source to help slow it down even more. I mean, if this is kind of old school bodybuilding advice right here, but as a meal before bed, that works well. Just some protein and some fat works very well before bed. So again, it doesn't have to be low carb, but from a practical standpoint, it can be. Like wouldn't necessarily need to have carbs at meal. And if you don't have carbs at meal right before bed, you can redistribute some of those carbs to dinner or pre-training, post-training, or in the morning, whatever. Just some food for thought there. You're probably wondering, where is the talk on fat? Well, back to the book. Next up, we're going to talk about fat intake. Quote, bodybuilders should follow a low-fat diet, as dietary fat, more so than carbohydrates or protein, is the easiest nutrient to be stored as body fat. Again, calorie intake is key. This was at the height of the low-fat era. However, I still think many bodybuilders and most even powerlifters probably respond best to low-fat diets versus low-carb diets at the end of the day. But research has shown there's very little difference between low-fat and low-carb diets, as long as the overall calories and proteins are equated. Really can't stress that enough. It really just comes down to personal preference. However, if we think back to the talk on energy systems, weight training performance is better when glycogen stores are filled up. And there is some blood glucose floating around. Like, think about that. Like, that's why a lot of times people will recommend to have some carbohydrates even during training, just because, hey, it tops off blood glucose. It gives a little bit of glucose floating around in blood, can help with performance. It's another reason why refeed days tend to be the best performing days. Like days when people are dieting, they have a refeed day. It helps kind of top off glycogen stores, get some blood glucose going around. Your training is better that day. So the diet that Aceto recommends is pretty much just protein, carbohydrates, and veggies. He also goes on to say that the only fat you should eat is what comes from protein containing foods, so like your meats. But he says, he recommends 15 to 20% of your total calories would come from fat. But I don't know. I that would be the case if you're eating fattier cuts of meats, like having some whole eggs and a lot of red meat, or fattier fish like salmon, etc. Then you could probably get 15 to 20%. But really, I mean, if you're just eating chicken, fish, and lean cuts of meat and egg whites and protein powder, you're not going to get 15 to 20% of your calories from fats. I mean, unless you're eating, I don't know. Like, I don't know how that would really be possible. I think you'd probably be getting 10% or under from fat if you're not making an effort to eat fattier cuts of meat. In my opinion, I just don't know. I think he's recommending 15 to 20%, but then he's also saying that you should only get your fat from your protein sources. So, and then he's really recommending low fat protein sources. So I think if you're going to do this, and this isn't like a necessarily bad thing when you're dieting. I like this method. It's just being like, hey, you know what? When we're dieting, we're going to go higher carb, lower fat. We're going to let our protein sources take care of most of the fat, whether that's through some whole eggs, whether that's having a red meat meal per day, whether that's having a salmon meal per day, taking fish oil, adding a tiny little bit of fat to our meals through the cooking process, things like that. Like that's a good method to do. And maybe you just have add like a tablespoon of peanut butter or 2 per day, and that kind of rounds out your fat, or have some almonds, something like that. And that's your only fat, like direct fat source. I think if you did that, then yeah, you would probably fall in that 15 to 20% of your total calories from fat, which isn't a bad method to go about things. I know a lot of people listening right now are probably like, well, shit, I thought fat was like this magical thing to help you get lean. I mean, it was weird how low fat was really popular and fat was demonized. And then in recent years, really, fat's kind of made a comeback where it even got so crazy that the whole bulletproof diet advice, the bulletproof coffee bullshit advice, where it was like, oh, keto fat burning is adding a stick of butter to your coffee with MCT oil. Like, in what world is adding a bunch of calories from fat to your morning coffee a fat loss tactic or even a fitness tactic? I mean, come on, like people get a little crazy. And even with in the paleo world, where again, when it was just, oh, everything had to be paleo and it was super popular, and that's when bacon made this huge comeback. Hey, nothing wrong with that. It's just you can't have an abundance of fat. And I mean, the numbers always have to make sense. You know, I think at the end of the day, that's what we always talk about. Like, the numbers have to make sense. And a lot of times when you just are adding fat, hey, fat is 9 calories per gram. Per gram, it's the most calorically dense thing there is fat. So when he says that fat leads to more storage or more fat, consuming dietary fat leads to more adipose tissue being accumulated, that's not necessarily the case from a calorie to calorie standpoint, but from a gram to gram standpoint, it is, because, hey, from a gram to gram standpoint, fat is more calorically dense than protein, carbs, or even alcohol. Alcohol is only 7 calories per gram. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about getting lean, so the fat loss process. Recall from a previous chapter, I said that I do not recommend drastically altering training for contest preparations. Whatever gave you the muscle in the first place will be the same training to enable you to hold on to it while dieting. Instead, allow your fat loss to come from dieting and cardio work. So this is something we talked about in part 1. When you're going on a fat loss diet, really your training shouldn't change all that much. Your resistance training should not change all that much. The amount of training that you use to build muscle and gain strength will be the same style of training. Training should have the same look and feel to maintain muscle and strength. All right, so what's the process? The process of getting lean. He recommends changing one variable at a time. I like that. And he recommends decreasing calories first. So it makes sense. Decrease calories first before adding any aerobic exercise. So before adding cardio, just decrease calories. And he recommends reducing calories by 25% initially, 100% through carbohydrates. So you pretty much just cut back 25% of your carbs. That's the first adjustment you make to your diet. And why is that significant? Well, it's significant because if you remember, really the only thing he recommends eating in your diet is protein and carbohydrates. So we don't have fat to reduce. And like I talked about early on in this episode, that kind of presents the same problem that keto diets have, is when you completely eliminate or almost eliminate an entire macronutrient, that leaves only one macronutrient to manipulate. In our case, it's carbs. We really only have carbs to manipulate. And in keto sense, you really only have fats to manipulate, because protein intake needs stay roughly the same. If anything, the deeper you get into a diet, they go up a little bit. So it's not anything that we'd be able to create a caloric deficit from. So when you're very limited on your options, it just makes things a little bit more difficult. But moving on. So when you get to a point where your 25% less carbs present an issue, you're getting to a point where things aren't working, the next thing you do, second, you'd add in some cardio work. So he recommends, going to the book, add cardio only when you see that the reduction in calories, carbs, is no longer working. That is, either you are not losing a half to 1 pound of fat, 2 pounds, up to 2 pounds a week, or you do not visually appear leaner. Just as there is no reason to severely cut calories to stimulate breakdown, there is no reason to go overboard with a drastic output in calories in an attempt to get leaner either. 3 30-minute sessions work. So essentially what he wants here is to start with 3 30-minute cardio sessions within that range we talked about, 65 to 75% of your max heart rate. And that's a great starting point. I mean, I love that. I mean, 3 30-minute cardio sessions is great. Now, one thing that I've been doing a lot lately, the last couple of years, is I put a high priority on tracking my clients' total daily expenditure pretty much directly through how many steps we're getting in a day. And I just find this to be a very, very good method. And really the reason I like tracking steps is because it encompasses 24 hours throughout the day. So a lot of times what will happen is people who, especially in this day and age, were very sedentary. So we add 3 30-minute cardio sessions a day, but that's still, it doesn't really take us up to, put it this way. I go for a walk every morning, and I go for about a 30-minute walk. And during those 30 minutes, I really only take about 4,500 steps, which, depending on, where you're at, but that it's not a lot. 4,500 steps isn't that much. So if I were to just stay in my office and do office work all day, which I do most of the time, I'm not getting many steps. So I have to actively even go for another walk throughout the day, or really just be mindful of the fact that I need to be a little bit more active. So I'm in a fat loss phase. I typically recommend a minimum of 8,000 steps per day. Really, and that's what we want to get to, about 8,000 steps per day. That just makes the fat loss process very much easier. So yeah, we should add some actual programmed cardio, and I do recommend that just because there is a difference between programmed cardio at a specific heart rate and just daily steps. But I kind of like daily steps as like the initial low-hanging fruit. So if we can just get our daily steps higher, that's kind of the first thing I want to do, is get our daily steps higher. And then when we get to a point where, okay, our daily steps are high, okay, well now let's add in some targeted cardio. And again, this is just lower intensity cardio, but let's throw that in. And those steps count towards your daily steps. So, again, if we're doing 8,000 to 10,000 steps per day, we get to a point where we add in some cardio, those steps still count. So it's not like we're really adding that much. It's just that you don't have to be quite as mindful of how active you are throughout the day. Now, I have clients that do construction work, and they laugh at those numbers. They're like, shit, I get 15,000 easy without even trying 15,000 steps a day. I have clients that get like 18,000 steps a day. So for them, really, activity level isn't an issue. Like, I very rarely even add any cardio to them at all. But then again, most of the time we have them dieting on really high calories. So we have a lot of room to move there. So cardio isn't 100% necessary. Shit, I've even had people do contest preps and not need to do cardio. It's rare, and adding in some cardio will allow you to eat more, and I think that's more sustainable. But it's not 100% necessary, especially if you live an active life. And the other benefit to tracking steps is the deeper you get into a diet, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, your NEAT, it tends to go down. You become less active. Even subconsciously, you stop fidgeting as much. You stop moving around as much. Just a lot of this is just very subconscious. You're in a diet. And I actually remember back in the day reading about bodybuilders who, when they were doing a contest prep, they would they would actually even pride themselves on, yeah, when I'm in a contest prep, I pretty much just lay around and watch movies in my free time. And I'm like, I used to think okay, yeah, that makes sense because you're training so hard and doing cardio and your diet's so strict, you want to keep yourself occupied so you're not thinking about food, which there's probably a benefit to that. But on the flip side, it's well, shit, you don't want to when during a fat loss phase, you don't want to actively become less active. You don't want to be, you want to be during a fat loss phase and, I'm actively being more sedentary. That's defeats the purpose. We can add all the cardio we want, and I've seen this happen. You add 30 minutes of cardio 3 days a week, but then the people just adjust by not walking. They don't move. So you almost eliminate the benefit of adding the cardio. So that's why we like to track steps as almost just a way to, okay, let's make sure our activity throughout the day is not going down, with the addition of cardio. So what he recommends is, so you add 3 30-minute sessions. And when 3 30-minute sessions no longer seem to work, add more slowly and gradually build up to no more than 45 minutes, 5 to 6 days a week. I like that. You don't really want to be doing hours and hours of cardio. If 45 minutes, 5 to 6 days a week isn't effective, we do talk a little bit about higher intensity cardio, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But really, just big picture here, if you're doing 6 days a week, 45 minutes of cardio, and that's not working, I mean, there's probably an issue. I mean, if we can't lower if calories are really low and you're doing 6 days of cardio at 45 minutes, I mean, maybe you're not in a good position to do a fat loss phase, which needs to be talked about. I mean, not everybody's in a good position physically and mentally to do a fat loss phase. I mean, from a physiological standpoint, people who are yo-yo dieters, people who are chronic dieters are always in a caloric deficit, and they just work themselves into a position where they require super low calories to get lean, which is a lot of people, mind you. And then they're kind of maintaining their weight on low amount of calories. Shit, they're in a position where it's probably not a good time to lose fat. You got to get them out of a deficit and spend some time in a surplus. Like actually spend some time focusing on building muscle, gaining strength, making some performance gains in the gym, and just staying out of a deficit for an extended period of time before it's a good time to diet again. Remember, we should be spending much more time in a surplus than we ever spend in a deficit. Let me say that again. We should spend more time in a surplus than we spend in a deficit. Our deficits, our fat loss phases should be targeted, goal-oriented. Like we're doing a fat loss phase for a specific outcome. We do it, we accomplish it, we get out of the deficit again. He does recommend doing cardio fasted. So back to the book. The best time to do cardio work is in the morning after rising on an empty stomach. The total amount of glucose from carbohydrate foods in the blood influences how quickly the body will tap into body fat as fuel. Even a small carb snack before cardio work can elevate insulin levels, and circulating insulin tends to oppose the use of fat as fuel. So again, he's using fasted cardio here. In practice, I like the use of fasted cardio for a couple reasons. One, I think if you do cardio first thing in the morning, it's more likely to get done. It's just convenient. You can do it first thing in the morning. I mean, that's when I go on my walks. I do my walks first thing in the morning. Well, actually, I'll wake up, check my emails, normally read a little bit, drink my cup of coffee, and then I go for my walk. But I still haven't ate anything. So I do my walks fasted just because it makes sense for me to do it at that time. And that's my way of being consistent with it. But research has shown that fasted cardio does not burn any more fat than fed cardio. So what he's saying here is it's in practice, it's not more effective. Fasted cardio is not more effective, but from a actual practicing standpoint, so a practical standpoint, if doing your cardio first thing in the morning is available to you, it's probably the best time to do it, just so you get it out of the way. And also, there is a benefit to doing your cardio away from your resistance training. Like you wouldn't want to do it. I mean, ideally, you wouldn't want to do a long cardio session before or after your resistance training. I mean, after is probably a little bit better than before. Just if you do a long cardio session pre-training, your performance in the gym is probably going to suffer a little bit. But ideally, the best time would be away from your resistance training. So if you do your cardio in the morning and lift in the afternoon, that's probably the best setup to have. So like I said, there are some things that show like, hey, fasted cardio may be better just for these reasons, but it's not going to be any more effective from an actual fat burning standpoint. Next up, we dig into low intensity versus high intensity cardio. So, intensity of cardio work is an important factor determining how lean you'll become. There's been a dispute over low intensity work versus high intensity work in recent years. The low intensity proponents will label lower intensity work as the quote unquote fat burning zone, like we talked about earlier. At high levels of intensity, the body burns a bit less fatty acids and more glycogen. However, working at a higher intensity can nearly double the amount of total calories burned in the same time period. Therefore, high intensity aerobics is better than low intensity aerobics because calories are burned and truly more fat is burned. When intensity increases, the percentage of fat used slightly decreases, but the total fat burned with higher intensity is significantly higher due to the greater caloric burn. All right, so he's talking about higher intensity being better than lower intensity cardio, which is interesting because during this time, the bodybuilders were pretty much just doing lower intensity, and then some research came out to support higher intensity. Then it seemed like everyone jumped ship with lower intensity and went all about higher intensity. And then now we're kind of shifting back to the middle. And really, my stance is kind of in the middle. Like, I actually really like lower intensity cardio for most people. I think that's really all we need to do. Low intensity cardio, just it tends to work well. It's not mentally draining. It's not physically draining. It's something you can do. It doesn't take any amount of willpower, really. I mean, you don't have to go hard during it. You can just throw on a podcast, listen to this podcast, and go for a walk. Go for a walk on a treadmill, jump on an elliptical, and just stay within that 65, 75% range and just bang out the cardio, get it done. It doesn't interfere with your resistance training. You can still train hard. It increases your daily steps. Just, it's good all around. And the downside to the higher intensity stuff, yeah, I mean, the benefit is it's more effective per time. Like, you can burn more calories in less amount of time, more fat in less amount of time, be more efficient with your cardio if you do higher intensity. But to do higher intensity correctly, I mean, I do like it and I do incorporate it, but only after we've kind of exhausted how much lower intensity I want to do, then we'll throw in some higher intensity. Unless people really enjoy doing higher intensity. If they just really enjoy higher intensity, then we will do that. But for the most part, you got to be careful with higher intensity because it's pretty much another workout. Like, it's almost another lower body session if done correctly. And what's interesting is how he describes it in the book. Really, he goes on to explain interval training, but the method of higher intensity interval training that he explains is not really the typical higher intensity session. So here's how he explains it. So, to the book, the best way to keep aerobic intensity high for long periods of time, up to 45 minutes at a clip, is to employ interval training. So, yeah, he's saying interval training is the best way to stay at high intensity for a long time. We get that. Interval training requires you to work as hard as possible, be it stationary cycling, stair climbing, or whatever your favorite mode of aerobic activity is, for 3 minutes, followed by 2 minutes of lower intensity work. Oh, so let me stop right there. So he says high intensity cardio requires you to work as hard as possible on whatever it is you're doing, cycling, stairs, whatever, for 3 minutes. Well, I don't know anybody who can work as hard as possible in a higher intensity sprint in 3 minutes for that amount of time. Like, 3 minutes, that's insane. And then only to rest for 2 minutes and then do that. I mean, that would be very, very hard. That would be very, very hard. I mean, there's a reason why most higher intensity intervals are very short, because you can only sprint for so long. You can only go as hard as possible for so long before you slow down. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, technically you can go as hard as possible for 3 minutes, but at what point do you slow down? You know, because that kind of defeats the purpose. And here's the bigger picture with this. And I think this is a big issue that people have just in general. And this is why I don't necessarily like doing higher intensity stuff for 3 minutes at a time. People want to fall into the middle, you know? Most people, when you have them go hard, they go a little bit less than what they probably are capable of. And then most people, when you have them go easy, they go a little bit harder than what they probably should to go easy, just because they just fall to the middle. So when you have someone doing higher intensity intervals, their hard as possible isn't quite as hard as possible. And then during the recovery session, they're probably going a little bit harder than they should. So in this sense, you go 3 minutes as hard as possible, 2 minutes of your lower intensity recovery. How long before it's damn near the same? You know, like, after how many intervals are the 3 minutes hard and the 2 minutes light? You could probably watch them. You could probably not even tell the difference. We want to avoid that. We don't want the middle ground here with higher intensity, because then you just turn into it's just moderate intensity. So what I like to do is keep the higher intensity intervals short, really only 10 to 15 seconds, because we want to keep that all out. And then the recovery is very slow. The recovery, you don't even have to do anything. Like, if you're doing an airdyne and you're doing like a 10-second or 15-second all-out sprint, you can pretty much just put your feet up and just move your arms during the recovery period. Like, the interval, we want to go as hard as possible during the intervals. I just don't think that anybody can go all-out effort for 3 minutes before they start slowing down, before they start coasting, you know? And like I said, you want to avoid turning higher intensity into just another moderate intensity session where you can barely even tell what the difference is between the hard part and the easy part. Really, what I would like and what I would really recommend is, just to make it simple, is to do 10 to 15 seconds all out, followed by 45 to 50 seconds of recovery. So within 1 minute, so for every minute, you got 10 to 15 seconds all out, followed by 45 to 50 seconds of recovery. So if you do 10 seconds all out, 50 seconds of recovery, or 15 seconds followed by 45 seconds of recovery. Or you could potentially even do, which would probably be hard, but doing like 20 seconds all out followed by 40 seconds of recovery. But I think that would still probably be a little bit too much. Again, with higher intensity cardio, we want to keep it high intensity. The Airdyne works amazing for this, but I mean, you can go outside and do sprints. You could do prowler pushing, sled drags, hill sprints. I mean, whatever. We just want to go very, very hard when we're doing the higher intensity. All right, so then what do we do when we've reduced carbs by 25%, we've added in lower intensity cardio, and then we've added in higher intensity cardio, and next up is you reduce carbohydrates another 25%. So we're pretty much at like 50% of what we started with. So we reduce another 25%. But this is where he starts talking about some non-linear dieting. So at this point, like I said, he recommends some non-linear dieting. So what we're going to do is he recommends doing 3 lower calorie days. So the 50% reduced carbs from where we started, the 3 lower calorie days, followed by 1 higher carb day. Essentially, what he's describing is the 1 higher carb day is like a refeed, but I mean, he doesn't call it that, but that's what it is. So 3 of the lower carb days followed by 1 day of higher carbs. And the higher carb day would really just be, I think, the numbers that we were doing before. So, whatever the second adjustment was, that would be the higher carb day. He talks about the benefit of throwing in that refeed day is offsetting the metabolic downshift that can occur with lower carbs and calories. But realistically, I mean, 1 day of higher calories is unlikely to make any type of metabolic differences. To really make a dent from a metabolic standpoint, you need something like a diet break, which ironically enough, he talks about next. However, not really in what we're talking about with a diet break, which we'll get to in a second. I want to talk about the refeed higher carb day. Couple things here. One, I mean, I like the addition to a higher carb day. So whether it's you do 3 low days and 1 higher carb day or 5 low days and 2 higher carb days, any type of cycle like that where you're throwing in a higher carb day from, throwing in a refeed. I like that method. So you go low and then throw in some refeeds. I like it more from a psychological standpoint than a physiological one. I just think it gives you something to look forward to. It helps you fill up your glycogen stores, get some glucose floating around. Like, it's good from a training performance standpoint on those days. And again, just some nonlinear dieting. At the end of the day, if the numbers still make sense, it can be very effective. Now, what we found is initially we thought there was more metabolic benefit than there really is, especially from like a one day of slightly higher carbs isn't going to really do a whole lot metabolically. But that doesn't mean it's not effective. I think where people get crazy with this is when they start doing like carb cycles, when you have a bunch of low days and then some high days and then some moderate days. If the only real carb cycle that I recommend is, let's say you have like your normal calorie day, and then you throw in 2 refeeds, and then maybe 1 off day, 2 off days or something, you would have slightly less calories. But for the most part, that makes things a little bit too complicated. It just becomes more complicated than it really is. At the end of the day, the numbers need to make sense, and throwing in carb cycles don't really add much benefit other than just from the benefits of the refeed. I mean, really, that like just from a psychological standpoint, there's no real metabolic benefits of doing a carb cycle. It's going to make you burn fat more. Like, it doesn't work that way. So I just like to make things as easy as possible. How can we make the diet as consistent and easy as possible? Well, to make it as simple as we possibly can. So getting into the diet breaks, and when I first read this book, I was like, oh shit, he's talking about diet breaks? I didn't know anybody really talked about that back then. Well, turns out the way he explains a diet break is, the way he explains all the benefits are the benefits of an actual diet break, But then really what his quote-unquote diet break is just 1 day of off-season eating, really. So going into a surplus. So it's like 1 day a week, you just do a surplus. So it's really just like an extreme refeed for 1 day. just an aggressive refeed. But still, that's not really enough time to make a difference metabolically. I mean, really with refeeds, a lot of times I like to set them up to where our refeeds are at least at maintenance calories. So really, he's not talking about all that much difference, maybe a couple hundred calories more than that. So how he explains to do it. Again, this isn't a terrible method. I like it. It's just the way he explains it isn't probably the way it goes. But so how he would set it up is you would also keep the one higher carb day in. So it would be 3 low days, 1 high carb day, and then 1 very aggressive refeed day, like off-season day. So it's 3 low, 1 high, 1 extra high. But really the cool thing about this is really what you're getting is you're going 3 low and then 2 high. That's really how he would set it up. But during this, when you add in the super aggressive higher calorie refeed day, he recommends lowering the calories on the lower days too. So you're really just getting a bigger difference between the low days and then the refeed day and then the super refeed day. But really the benefits he's looking for, all the metabolic benefits of kind of getting to the point where you're struggling. What I would do is I would just throw in a whole week diet break. And people didn't really talk about like full long week diet breaks in the 90s. I don't think even in the early 2000s, no one really talked about it, but I think it's a good method to almost plan in a diet break into a fat loss phase. So if you have a long fat loss phase, kind of set it up to be able to throw in a week of maintenance eating, and you're going to get a lot of benefit you're going to get some physiological benefit, but you'll also get a huge psychological benefit, like a complete week off the diet. Your training is going to get better. It's kind of like a reset, and then you get right back on the plan, and then you finish out your diet. So you kind of set it up to where maybe the first half is like the pre-diet. You kind of just get yourself in kind of the striking range of where you ultimately want to be, throw in the diet break, and then you finish hard really aggressively. That's pretty much how I like to set it up. So as soon as you come back from the diet break, it's like, okay, we're a sprint to the finish. Next up, he talks about the glycemic index, which we're not going to talk a lot about, kind of for the same reason why I skipped the section on insulin. However, I do want to point out one of the things he talks about is he does actually talk about how the glycemic index of food changes when it's combined with other foods, which kind of is the reason why it's not even worth talking about all that much. But when you add protein, fiber, and fat to a high glycemic carbohydrate source, it lowers it. So really, at the end of the day, these details don't make much of a difference. The glycemic index is not really something that we need to concern ourselves with. He does talk about one other method that he calls a variable low-carb diet, and he recommends this for endomorphs, so essentially just people who struggle to lose body fat. And with this method, this is how he explains the variable low-carb diet. So you start with 100 grams of carbs a day. So protein would probably stay the same, and you drop carbs all the way to 100 grams. You eat 50 grams in the morning at breakfast and another 50 grams after a training session. You do that for 3 days, so 3 low days at 100 grams, and then have the 4th day a refeed day with 400 grams of carbs. So you do that, and then when you hit a roadblock or a plateau, then you extend to 5 low days before a high day, and then you eventually get to a point where you drop to 30 grams of carbs for 3 days, and then have 2 days of 100 grams, and then 1 day of the 400 grams refeed. So really what we're doing here is, he also recommends, the protein he recommends to go up, not stay the same for the variable low-carb diet. So he provides a sample here for a 200-pound bodybuilder. So for a 200-pound bodybuilder, you would have 100 grams of carbs a day and 400 grams of protein. You do that for 3 days in a row. Then on the 4th day, you'd have 400 grams of carbs and 100 grams of protein. And then once you hit a roadblock and plateau, you do 100 grams of carbs, 400 grams of protein for 5 days in a row. Then have the 400 grams of carbs, 100 grams of protein for the 6th day. And then you would drop to 30 grams of carbs with 400 grams of protein for 3 days. Then 2 days at 100 grams of carbs, 400 grams of protein. And the 6th day is 400 grams of carbs and 100 grams of protein. I don't know if you stuck with me there, but just from an interesting standpoint here, he also provides the sample menu for the 200-pounder. This menu is 100 grams of carbs, 400 grams of protein. So this is what it is. Meal 1, half a cantaloupe, 3 rice cakes, and 14 ounces of chicken breast. So that's 50 carbs, 66 grams of protein. Meal 2, 9 ounces of tuna, a cup of lettuce. Meal 3, 10 ounces of steak, half a cup of asparagus. Meal 4, 3 scoops of protein powder mixed in water. Meal 5, it must have been post-workout, 10 ounces of turkey, 8 ounces of yam. And then meal 6 is 3 scoops of protein powder and 2 cups of sugar-free Jell-O. 400 grams of protein, 100 grams of carbs. All right, so the next couple sections we're going to skip. He talks a little bit about contest prep, depleting and loading, contest prep, peaking. Before we get into supplements, actually, we're going to talk briefly about gaining muscle. And really his recommendations for adding mass he's still not big on adding too many grams of fat. It's mostly just kind of the reverse of the fat loss process is just adding carbohydrates. Big on just adding carbohydrates. And then if you struggle with gaining muscle, he'll recommend adding in some fattier cuts of meat. So really, we're not talking about all that much different than the fat loss. I mean, he still recommends the same type of stuff, just higher carbohydrates, and then keeping your body fat in check, which is key. Like, we get to a point where I think sometimes people don't recognize that super crazy huge caloric surpluses aren't needed. Like a moderate surplus is just as effective as gaining muscle is a huge surplus. So you don't need to gain a crazy amount of body fat just to put on muscle. However, to build muscle, you need to be in a caloric surplus. I mean, you absolutely need to be in a caloric surplus. So don't try to middle it. Don't try to, I'm trying to gain muscle, but I'm still worried about being shredded, so I'm not really allowing myself to build muscle, and really you're just still eating at a deficit. Like, you're not going to build muscle that way. You're not going to gain strength that way. And going back to the book, Chris talks about this. When I first started training, I was under the impression that gains in muscle mass should be accompanied by little or no increases in fat levels. I read the magazines, and all the guys claimed to stay in great shape all the time. I would see a photo from one year, and the following year, a particular bodybuilder would show great progress. I assumed he stayed in competition shape year-round. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is okay to gain fat in the off-season while trying to add muscle, as long as you are gaining more muscle than fat. Some bodybuilders train a full year and make little progress, while others make big gains. Those who are making the big gains gain more fat than you think. They do not stay ripped. A rule of thumb is to eat enough calories to feel good and strong so you can generate enough power in the gym to really push a set to failure. Really, what we're talking about is just you need to be in a caloric surplus. Like, that's the end of the day. That's what you need. If you're gaining weight, you need to be in a caloric surplus. If you're not gaining weight, well, you're not in a caloric surplus. It's very, very similar to what you need to do when you're dieting, just the reverse. He doesn't like cardio work for bodybuilders or really anybody whose focus is gaining muscle. In my opinion, no bodybuilder who wishes to gain muscle mass should ever do aerobics in the off-season. Weight training is an activity that creates an anabolic state. Aerobic training creates a catabolic state. Weight training will improve and increase the release of anabolic hormones in the body to support growth, while aerobic training can counteract this by decreasing the output of these hormones. Yes and no. I mean, there are some benefits to adding in some cardio all throughout the year. I mean, not only will you be able to eat more, but having a better aerobic system helps the recovery process as long as it's done right, doesn't take away from it. Also improves work capacity. You're able to get more work done in the same amount of time. So I think everyone should do a little bit of cardio work, but it doesn't have to be formal. Just be active. Just get those daily steps up. When you're trying to gain muscle, yeah, you can lower your amount of steps. You don't need to be doing cardio when you're trying to build muscle. But I also don't think it's smart to avoid it. Just I think it's one of those things where I think we need to be more active. I think we need to get up off our asses more. So again, that kind of points to why I like to track steps. Is if you're sedentary, you live a sedentary life like most of us do, I think there's a huge benefit to being more active. When I started being more conscious of how many steps I was taking in a day, my joints started to feel better. My workout started to go better. There's a lot to be said for that. All right, let's finish up with supplements, and we'll wrap this one up. The first supplement he recommends is protein powder, which makes sense to the book. To eat 5 or 6 meals a day with protein at each meal can become downright time-consuming. The chicken, meat, fish, and eggs have to be prepared, or you can include things like sliced turkey, fat-free cheese, lean roast beef, etc. as a quick alternative. Another quick alternative is protein powder. And protein, really, this is why I recommend it so much, is really to eat 5 meals a day, 4 meals a day even, is a pain in the ass. Hitting your daily protein is a struggle for most people, but protein powder becomes very easy because it tastes good. All you gotta do is throw a scoop in a shaker with some milk or with water, shake it up, and boom, you got 25 grams of protein. So protein powder, there's nothing magical about it, but it's very, very convenient. Going back to the book, of the many powders today, the 2 main sources of protein come from casein, the protein common to milk, and the other popular protein is whey, which is derived from the cheese-making process. While there are some differences among the proteins, the most important factor in terms of protein, especially when trying to build mass, is the total quantity of protein consumed each day. Yeah, at the end of the day, total protein intake is what's most important. No matter what type of protein powder you choose, if you underconsume protein, you will not build any appreciable muscle mass. This is very important. Like you got to eat enough protein at the end of the day. I talk to a lot of high school kids, and it's like they'll always ask me, like, "Hey, I want to get protein powder, this and that." Which, hey, I recommend protein powder to everybody because it's more convenient, makes it easier to hit your protein goals for the day. But you have to have protein goals for the day. Adding a protein shake in, while beneficial, still is nothing magical. Like here's 2 scenarios. Person A takes a protein shake but has 80 grams of protein total per day. Person 2 has 150 grams of protein per day but doesn't take a protein shake. Who's going to have better results? Well, most likely the person that's consuming 150 grams of protein a day, even though they're not consuming a protein shake. At the end of the day, total protein amounts is what's most important. What's interesting is he recommends a whey and casein mix. He says that's probably best to get the best of both worlds, the fast absorbing whey and the slow acting casein. Next up, he talks about branched chain amino acids, pretty high on BCAAs, which, hey, branched chains, hey, they are what they are. I think if your overall protein intake is adequate throughout the day, you probably don't need to supplement with branched chains. Next up, he talks about glutamine. I remember glutamine being popular back in the day. I remember going to Walmart and buying glutamine. And, just came in the tub and taking 5 grams of glutamine a day. Hey, and glutamine, although it hasn't been shown to really have any muscle building or performance benefits, it is good for the immune system. It is good for the digestive tract. So, I mean, if you take glutamine, it is good for the immune system and GI health. So there is that. Other he recommends chromium picolinate. I remember when everyone took that too. Again, when he's talked about insulin so much, of course, he's going to recommend chromium. Then he recommends vanillyl sulfate too. It's very similar to chromium, really glucose disposal agents. Then he recommends creatine, the gold standard. Recommends creatine. He recommends a bunch of other stuff too. L-carnitine. He recommends ephedra before ephedrine was banned. Recommends caffeine. Recommends pro-hormones. This was back when pro-hormones were still legal as well. It's interesting how he recommends andro. That was the pro-hormone that Mark McGuire was caught with or allegedly caught with. You can just be able to buy andro at GNC, which is crazy to think of. Like it was a super effective pro-hormone, and you could just go into GNC and buy andro before pro-hormones got banned. Crazy. Recommends some other things too, and then we get into some vitamins and minerals, but pretty basic stuff. So that's pretty much the book. Shit, we got through it. We got through the book. Championship Bodybuilding. It's good stuff. Like I said in the beginning, like there was a lot of good information, but a lot of stuff. And I admit that I kind of went through and I kind of picked stuff that I wanted to talk about more. So a lot of the stuff I ended up talking about was stuff that I didn't necessarily agree with. So that's just kind of how I set it up. But I'm not necessarily thinking that this will be the method of of each book I go over. But hey, there's a lot of good information here. It was written in 1996, so I would expect people's opinions to change as the science improves, as we get more information. It's just interesting to see what the content was in 1996 and kind of what stuff stood the test of time, and then what stuff, we might want to look at and change. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed doing it. It was fun. And until next time, guys, peace. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Absolute Strength Podcast. I know I had a ton of fun producing it for you. And before you go, if you could just drop me some feedback, I'd love it. I love reading your feedback. So you can go over to iTunes, leave a 5-star rating, write a little review, what you think of the podcast. I absolutely love it. I read every single one. But it's cool if you don't want to do that. I get it. No one wants to really go out of their way to do anything, let alone write a review. But I want to get your feedback. So drop me a line on Instagram at Hunt Fitness, or on Facebook, Kyle Hunt, or on Twitter, or send a pigeon or something. I don't know. I just want to hear your feedback. So if you want to give me some feedback, let me know what you think. Hit me up on Instagram at Hunt Fitness. And before you go, I have one last thing I want to say. I have a program I want you to check out. It's actually called the Absolute Strength Program, and the link is in the show notes. It's a program I designed to help increase my own squat, bench, and deadlift. And I got pretty strong off of it, and I think you're going to like it. It's a great book. Thousands of people have got amazing results from it. It's in the show notes. All right, guys. Until next time, until next episode, peace.